How many of you are morning people? You're not my students, I guarantee you that. As I walk around the campus, being a little bubbly in the morning, I have kids who will look at me and go, shh, take it down, Doc, take it down. What I'd like to do today, and I appreciate Doug's and Jim's inviting me here, is to talk about education and inclusive excellence within the framework of engineering. You know, I sent a note to some of my engineering colleagues and asked them for some advice and to give me some examples of some of the things we're doing on our campus. We've gotten this designation as #1 up and coming. The term is not really explanatory within itself. It has to do with academic innovation. And I want to talk about just that. And I start with this notion that for any part of an organization, the College of Engineering or an engineering departments, for any unit at an institution to be as effective as it wants to be with entrepreneurship, for example, and innovation, that unit has to look at the larger context of society, but also of the institution itself. It's difficult for a dean of engineering or engineering faculty to be their best and to really to support and promote innovation if there isn't a climate of that innovation throughout the institution, because you're not self-supporting in all ways. Your students in engineering are being exposed to people in the arts and humanities and social sciences. And if you find that people in other disciplines tend to look down on or not to appreciate the value of innovation and entrepreneurship, you're not able to support students and to inspire students to be their best in thinking about these things. And I bring that up because I have the privilege of working with new college presidents every year in the Harvard program, and I've done it now for maybe 15 years. And one of the questions that I get from new presidents is this: how do I help my colleagues in the STEM areas not to think that high standards will necessarily mean most people won't make it? That most people won't make it. That when a lot of students flunk, it's just because it's rigorous and we have very high standards, and we stop there. And I want to talk about what that means. The campus is an interesting one in that we have students from 150 countries. And if you were to ask me why I think we're doing so well, I would say the international influence, more than any other, has a major impact on what happens on our campus. Because what we find is that large numbers of students from other countries, and regardless of race, whether they're from Nigeria or the islands or Russia or China, tend to be first-generation Americans, often very hungry for the knowledge, very appreciative, wanting to be the very best. I remember we have a lot of focus groups on our campus, and I remember having a focus group to talk about study habits and how much people studied. And what we found was that the shorter the period of time in America, the harder the people tended to work. It sounds simplistic, but it was very interesting. That's not to say you don't have some people born in this country who work hard, but quite frankly, the students from other countries just seem to be so intense about it. And I was asking a group of students from all over the world, there were maybe 20 in the room, and I said, well, why is that? Why is it that it seems that those sometimes who haven't been here as long or who came when they were 13 have just worked so hard? And a young woman from Jamaica said, I don't mean to insult my American friends. She said, but it seems to me that for many Americans, going to college is grade 13. It's what you do, particularly if you have the money or the advantage. This is the next thing that you do. She said, and so it's the icing on the cake. She said, but for me, if I don't succeed and become this physician that I'm determined to become, my younger brothers and sisters may not eat. And so education is not the icing on the cake, it is the very bread of life. And there was a kind of sense of urgency that she had. And it was so important for my American students to see the look in her eyes as she talked about education as the most important thing in her life. And so I start with that notion that somehow in America right now, we have this challenge when thinking about the global marketplace and competitiveness, global competitiveness, to think through how to help our students to understand what we see when we look around the world. Some of you have read Daniel Pink's, how many of you read Daniel Pink's book, A Whole New Mind? Good. If you haven't, you should read it. And the next one that came out from him is Drive on Motivation. Another one which is really significant, and I was really impressed with Doug's using it as a beginning, something in the spirit of a whole new mind. That tree I found fascinating. We all had different perceptions about what that meant. For me, the first thought I had was the notion of rigid defiance. There's a quote that you may remember that said that a major tree, an oak tree or whatever, will be able to last because it does not stand in rigid defiance. It learns how to be more flexible. You notice how it was bending, but it didn't break because it had the ability. And I thought about how important that symbol was in a conference like this, because the challenge we face as we think about our institutions and the culture of our institutions, one of our challenges is to encourage and support both colleagues and students in opening their minds and thinking about the possibilities, ways in which we might be somewhat different. One of the points that he makes, that Pink makes in the book A Whole New Mind, is this. He says that the era of left-brain dominance and the information age that it engendered is giving way to a new world in which artistic and holistic right-brain abilities mark the fault between who gets ahead and who falls behind. Our brains are divided into two hemispheres. The left is sequential, logical, and analytical. The right is nonlinear, intuitive, and holistic. Today, the defining skills of the previous era, the left brain capabilities that powered the information age, are of course necessary, but no longer sufficient. And the capabilities we once disdained or thought frivolous, the right brain qualities of inventiveness, empathy, joyfulness, and meaning, increasingly will determine who flourishes and who flounders. For individuals, for families, for organizations, professional success and personal fulfillment now require a whole new mind. Now, in that spirit, let me ask a question that upsets Americans sometimes. How many of you believe that there are many more brilliant Chinese and Indian children than American children? I have some hands, others begin to think about the questions, right? I have others saying, how could you possibly say that? Don't you believe in our children somehow? Of course I believe in our children. I still think we have the greatest country in the world. But it's not a politically incorrect question, is my point. It is, quite frankly, a mathematical question. Now, I am somebody who's always gotten goosebumps doing math, absolute goosebumps. This is, and I have promised in every speech to mention, this is the 50th anniversary of the Children's March in my hometown, in Birmingham. And I was privileged to be a part of that march and had the experience of literally sitting in the back of the church, being placated by doing math problems. That was the only way my parents could get me to sit there and listen to people talk. Doing math problems and listening to a man say that if the children participate in this march, they'll have a chance to go to a better school. And I wanted to go to a better school because I was always a fat little nerd. I always wanted to be the best. And I always knew those schools for the white kids, quite frankly, had more resources. And so I've always associated math and being empowered to do more and more and more. And what is significant is that in our country, we tend to think about, of course our kids are as bright as anybody else. Well, of course they are. But mathematically, here is the point. You have 1.3 billion Chinese, 1.1 billion Indians in the world. Now, the top 10% of any population will be extraordinary. You put those two together, you got 2.4 billion people. 10% of 2.4 billion is, this is one group who can tell me the answer to that. Come on, what's the answer? You said, like, obviously. Well, you'd be surprised how many American audience look at me like I'm crazy when I ask that question. Wait a minute. But so 240 million people, right? Well, America has about 310 million people. So those two countries have almost as many geniuses as we have citizens. Think about it. So when you go to anybody's doctoral program, whether it's at UMBC or wherever in the country, you will find those two populations heavily, heavily represented. As Norm Augustine would say, 2/3 of the PhDs in engineering are granted to people from other countries. Heavily, those two. Now, I find that a remarkable statement for this reason. First of all, it's wonderful that our universities are so good that people from all over the world continue to come here to get an education. Number two, if you come to my part of the country in the Baltimore-Washington corridor and you go to the national agencies, whether it's NIH all the way to NSA, you'd be surprised how many of the people in those agencies were started their education in other countries. And so we have been privileged. The only reason, quite frankly, many would say that we have been as powerful as we have been is that we have attracted the best of brain power from all over the world. The challenge, as you know right now, is that many of the people who come to this country don't necessarily have to stay here when they graduate. In fact, my Indian students in mathematics and stat are often, and computer science are often going back now, sometimes working for multinational companies like IBM over in India. And that's fine for the company, but when thinking about what's going to make this country as competitive as possible, we need as many people here who will become interested in science and engineering and who will do well. So the point is that we know we cannot compete on the basis of numbers. As powerful and as healthy as our country is, it is a small country in terms of population. What we have that has made us as special as we are, quite frankly, innovation and creativity. Innovation and creativity, and having such a rich diversity of people. If you look at the Nobel laureates throughout the 20th century, you'll find that many grew up in homes in New York, for example, where parents didn't speak English well. They came out from different countries in Europe. They went to the poor man's Harvard, City College, or Brooklyn College. They went on and became the very best, from the arts all the way over to engineering. And just look at the Nobel laureates, and you'd be surprised at the surprisingly disproportionately large numbers who began their education in other countries. I think the point about this is not to say anything that's disparaging, but rather to be inspired. Because what made the difference? Values. Values. There's no doubt about it. I love this foundation's emphasis on societal impact and knowing that people want the personal fulfillment and the idea of combining the technical skills and the customer engagement coupled with the idea of societal values and what we do to make a difference in the lives of people. I had the privilege of speaking to top 200 leaders at Northrop Grumman recently. We have a major partnership with them. Northrop Grumman has worked with us in setting up probably 15 to 20 cybersecurity companies. The campus has 85 companies on campus. We have biotech to IT companies, started by our faculty, our graduates, and people from the Hopkins campus, and also in collaboration with a range of different major institutions. One of the reasons that Northrop Grumman decided to work with us in helping some of the young entrepreneurs in cybersecurity to start companies was they said, let's look at how younger, smaller companies can be as entrepreneurial and innovative as possible and see if we as a major company, as a large company, can learn from them. Because the larger we are sometimes, quite frankly, the more resistant people can be to change. And so it spoke volumes about Wes Bush as the CEO and others that people wanted to look at ways of working with other kinds of institutions and companies in an effort to build diversity of different kinds. One of the exciting areas right now that they're working with us on is getting more women into those areas in cybersecurity. When you look at the cyber competitions in our area, what is, to me, an embarrassment for our country is it's 95+% men, primarily white men. And the fact is we want as many Americans of all types in these efforts, but we know, as you know, we need to have more women, more people of color, because the country is changing dramatically. If you talk to the people at the National Science Foundation, you will hear this from the computational sciences area to other areas, that quite frankly, there are all these jobs that are going to need people to fill them, and yet if you put women and people of color together, you're talking about almost 60% of the American population. And so they will tell you that the question of underrepresentation and underproductivity in STEM are inextricably linked. That we have to find ways of having more Americans of all types succeeding in all these areas. Now, here is the question I ask you. When people ask you the question, what do we mean by innovation, as you think about entrepreneurship, what comes to mind? For me, it means a willingness to look in the mirror as a country, as a university or college, as an engineering area, as a foundation. It means looking in the mirror and being healthy enough to point to the good, the bad, and the ugly, to be able to understand what works well and what may not be working as well. It's exciting to me to see the country focusing so much attention on STEM. The question becomes, though, are we willing to look at the data and to analyze it in such a way that we determine how we might need to change the way we do business? For example, everybody's read Norm Augustine's report, the Gathering Storm report. After that report, the several senators, including my own, Senator Mikulski and former Senator Clinton and the late Senator Kennedy, asked that a new commission be established to look at the question of underrepresentation. Because while the Gathering Storm report speaks quite eloquently about the challenge of global competitiveness, it did not give any attention to the relationship between underrepresentation of Americans in STEM and, quite frankly, how competitive we can be as a nation, given that we are increasingly diverse as a population. And so I chaired that commission, and the statistics were fascinating. It did not surprise anyone that only 20% of African Americans and Hispanics who started with a major in science and engineering actually graduated with a major in science and engineering, because people said, well, the K through 12 problem is the real issue. It was a stunning statistic, however, when we saw that only 1/3 of white Americans who begin with a major in science and engineering graduate with a bachelor's in science and engineering. Stunning. And even for the highest achieving group in our country, I just talked about it, Asian Americans, it's only 41%. Now, the first response from our colleagues on the commission, these were people from a range of institutions, from Harvard and MIT to Hispanic serving institutions and others. Our first thought was, well, the students are just not well prepared. But what we found is that while we know that K through 12 is an issue we need to focus on, that's just why Project Lead the Way is so important. My campus heads the effort in our state, and we've been educating hundreds of faculty members and literally maybe 100+ high schools and middle schools, and working on project-based management. It's very interesting to see how we can increase the numbers interested in engineering through Project Lead the Way. But the fact is that beyond the K through 12 issue, there's another fundamental question. How many universities can tell customers, if we think about potential families as customers, how many universities can tell those potential students and their parents the probability that a student who enters that institution will actually, interested in engineering, will actually graduate in engineering? I want you to think about that just for a minute. Few institutions have looked by gender, by race, by department in engineering to say, okay, we had 100 white women who started in mechanical engineering, and of that 100, 30 actually graduated, or whatever the number is. And so one of my points to you today, in the spirit of a whole new man, is to go back and get the data. In fact, I would say this: if somebody in this room right now can tell me by race and gender the probability of a student entering the institution in engineering, in your particular department, for example, the probability by race and gender that that person will graduate, I will give you $1,000 on the spot. Don't you dare raise your hands. I'm speaking metaphorically. Good humor, not a bad thing, not a bad thing. But I'm saying it that way to challenge you, because most places, I mean, some places have begun to look at that, but as a rule, we've not done it. And here is the point that sounds counterintuitive. And listen very carefully. Sylvia Hurtado at UCLA has done a lot of work looking at performance of students by race and gender. The higher the SATs or ACTs, the higher the number of AP credits in math and science, the more prestigious the university, the greater the probability the student will leave science and engineering within the first year or two. Let me say it again, because it sounds absolutely the opposite of what you'd expect. The better prepared the student is, the more selective the university. The student enters in engineering and science. Within a year or two, the student has left. I have gotten a lot of honorary degrees because of what UMBC is doing, and the fact that we've made such progress in some of these areas. And I was at one very prestigious institution, and they had students in the humanities stand and students in the social sciences stand, and one of the students gets up and gives a wonderful address in Greek, and it's just amazing, and somebody else is talking in Latin, and amazingly, they had the students graduating in engineering to stand, and people giggled. Why did they giggle? Because there were so few. Because so many students had started in those areas and did not succeed. Now, what usually people will say is, well, they just want to go and make a lot of money, so they went into whatever, to go to Wall Street. Not true. If I go to college as the valedictorian from my school, and all of a sudden, I find myself getting a C or a D in the engineering or the chemistry, and I get an A in the humanities, of course I like that humanities course better. And of course I'm not going to tell people that I didn't do well in another area. I said to all of the institutes at NIH that often students start off in pre-med, and those students end up becoming great lawyers. It happens all the time. And interestingly enough, the general counsel for NIH came up and she said, you just told my story. I had perfect SAT, went to the best of the best, started off in pre-med, and within the first year was so embarrassed, changed, and now I'm a lawyer. And I've been embarrassed all these years to tell people that story. Now, it happens all the time. What is the message that I'm giving? It is that as we think about entrepreneurship and innovation and the need to increase the numbers, first of all, the numbers of people who are being educated in engineering, and then those who will be entrepreneurial and will be interested in helping and making a difference in society, we need to look at the culture of our institutions to make sure that people who have these dreams, as I began my conversation today, these dreams of becoming engineer are actually fulfilled. Because I would argue that morally, if we accept students into our institutions and into our programs, we have a certain responsibility to help them succeed if they're willing to work hard. If we don't think they are prepared to do it, the question is, why would we admit them to the institution? And I often have said to campuses and to my own campus, if we're doing it simply because we need the numbers for the budget, it's not a moral stance. That if we accept them, we should feel some responsibility to help them succeed and to see their dreams fulfilled. So when I moved to UMBC years ago, the challenge we face is the one that so many places face, and that is that many students were not doing well, and minority students particularly. And we are probably 15% African American on our campus, and black kids just were not able to compete against my students who had come from China and Russia. And quite frankly, what people hadn't looked at was a large number of the white Americans were also not doing as well in those areas. And I often make the point that if you show me a campus where minority students are not doing well, I'll show you a campus where a lot of white kids are not doing well either. The difference is that the base, the numbers will be larger. From my own alma mater, I went to undergrad at Hampton and then Illinois, and when I worked with my grad alma mater at Illinois, it's true that we graduate a lot of engineers at Illinois, of course, but the base is so large that you don't look at all those who leave from the areas from whites, but the base for the minorities will be much smaller, so it becomes a much more obvious problem. And so my point is that I was convinced 20-some years ago that if we could figure out how to solve that really difficult challenge of some of these underrepresented groups, we could learn and identify strategies that could help with all students. And at the heart of the work we did with Meyerhoff in the beginning for black kids and now for students of all races was this notion of building community among the students, of having interaction between the faculty and the students, of getting students involved in undergrad research. Many of the points that Douglas talked about in the pyramid were critical, of helping students to appreciate the value of STEM to the country itself and what it means. And so it had to do with how we thought about the culture of the institution. In the earlier years, some of my colleagues, when we talked about the fact that more than half the students in chemistry were not succeeding, the typical response is that's about normal. But the question is, if it's about normal, does that mean it's the right thing or it's the only way it can be done? It seems to me that innovation, as we think about being entrepreneurial, innovation has to do with saying, perhaps it's always been done this way, but how might it be done differently? Does it have to be this way? When I was in that children's march, quite frankly, 50 years ago, America was very different from today. I would not possibly have been standing looking at you, and you would not have been looking at me. And so we know that people have had to get beyond the box, beyond the normal way of doing things to make progress in our country, whether talking about women in engineering or my standing here today as president of a predominantly white university. When I was growing up, I never even saw a white person other than on TV. So the world has changed dramatically for those of us who've been fortunate to get an education. And the question always for me is, how do we teach our students and ourselves to ask the good questions? Rabi, a Nobel laureate, said that when he was growing up in New York, many of his friends' parents would ask them, the mothers especially, would ask them at the end of a day, what did you learn in school today? He said, but not my Jewish mother. My Jewish mother would say, Izzy, did you ask a good question today? And the practice of encouraging his curiosity, he said, made him the thinker he became, and going on to get the Nobel Prize. And I think that's the point. When you think about entrepreneurship, when you think about, quite frankly, when I think about engineering and creative problem solvers, you've seen this statement that, the scientists maybe explain what's happening right now. These engineers are creating things that have never existed before, taking it to the next level. But to create something that has not existed before, you've got to ask the right questions. And it seems to me that at the heart of innovation, and as we think about entrepreneurship, it's just that. And it's creating a culture that encourages people to ask the right questions and to be willing to take risks. There's an element of risk involved in entrepreneurship. I was out working with some of my alums who have companies out in the Silicon Valley area, and there were maybe 15 in the room, and I was saying 2 or 3 things to them. I was saying, guys, why is it that this is all men except for one woman in the room? What can we do about that? Why is it that it's mainly white and Asian? What are we, just getting them to think about those questions and not to feel so comfortable with it always being the same people in the room is a question to ask, you see. But one of the things they said that was so amazing was each one of them was doing well now, because when you come to have dinner with your president, you want to brag. You want people to see you're successful. If you're not doing too well, you don't typically come to the dinner, right? The alums who come back to your campuses tend to be doing fairly well, unless they're looking for a job, of course, right? But the fact is that they were all doing really well, but every one of them had had at least one company to fail. But when they said it with a kind of fascination because they had learned from the failure. As you know, in science and engineering and in life, sometimes we learn much more from being knocked down than from simply being built up because we were successful. I mean, the question is, what do you learn from? And it was not an embarrassment that they had tried something and it didn't work. It was rather an opportunity to learn and to set a foundation on which they could build and do much more. Interestingly enough, when thinking about culture, Gary Kelly is the CEO of an organization that I am really impressed by. And the organization is called Southwest. I'm very impressed by Southwest. I watch how employees on the planes act. And he talks about the values they have, about supporting each other, about engaging with customers, about having fun in the process and being a little silly sometimes, not taking themselves so seriously. And there's a climate there, I think, that is fascinating, particularly different from what we tend to have in universities. I sometimes say to my colleagues, folks, let's laugh a bit more, because the academic way is to be a little cynical. You say, you're looking, you're asking questions, but you don't tend to laugh a lot. I am convinced that the most interesting and creative environments will have both the hard questions being asked, but also a time not to take ourselves so seriously and to be able to get beyond the linear approach to whatever we're doing. But he said this that I think is fascinating. He said that the term culture seems to have gained steam recently, and it's now a buzzword used in most companies and business schools. Admittedly, culture is hard to define, but he said, your business plan actually is what you are, but culture is who you are. I really like that. The culture is who you are. My colleagues and I have been talking a lot about culture, and the former provost at UMBC and I wrote a piece called Changing the Culture on Campus, and we said this: we view the culture of the institution as manifesting itself in every aspect of daily life on the campus. It is reflected in the questions we ask and those we don't, the achievements we measure and highlight and those we ignore, and the initiatives we support or don't support. We believe that changing our institutional culture to focus more directly on broad societal challenges is critical to the future of higher education and to the larger society. And so when you think about the culture in engineering on your campuses, I'd ask you to think about the question, how does the culture in engineering compare with the culture of the overall institution? To what extent is the president or the provost and others on the campus actually appreciative of the culture you're developing in your programs that focus on entrepreneurship and innovation? And do students see the consistency between what you're doing there and what happens in the rest of the institution? Is there an appreciation, quite frankly, of the value of science and engineering to society? Again, Norm Augustine talks about, and he's on our board of University System of Maryland, a number of students, he says, have shown that 50 to 85% of the growth in America's GDP is attributable to advancements in science and engineering. And based on the experience of the past 50 years, each percent increase in GDP corresponds to an increase of about 1 million jobs. And so the question becomes, are campuses appreciative of the role of engineering and science, and how best do we create an environment and a culture that encourages faculty members, quite frankly, to look at ways of increasing the numbers of students who have some success in science and engineering? You know, I find it very interesting that as I've talked around the country about this underrepresentation, and about the fact that when you look at the 24-year-olds in America, only 6% of all 24-year-olds in America have bachelor's degrees in science and engineering. In Europe, it's about twice that percentage, and in some Asian countries, much more than that. And we know that to be competitive and to continue to be one of the top countries in the world, we're going to need to find ways of increasing these numbers. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples very quickly of what we're doing in engineering, and then go to questions. Ann Spence, who leads our Project Lead the Way, is also one of our really spectacular faculty members in mechanical engineering, and interestingly enough, has helped to lead an effort in engineering, as we've had one in science, focused on redesigning courses. And the University System of Maryland has worked to begin getting other institutions in our system to do that. The Chemistry Discovery Center, if you go to the UMBC website, and many of my students in engineering are in chemical engineering, and I should tell you, in our state, we have the highest percent in STEM for all institutions other than the Naval Academy. 45% of our bachelor's degrees are in science and engineering. About 60% of our students start in that area, and about 45% right now the degrees. So that gives you a sense of the retention in those areas. We've been working to increase that number. But the Chemistry Discovery Center is fascinating because it's based on the concept of entrepreneurship, with the problems coming out of biotech companies on the campus, and more important than that, with the emphasis being on group work for much of the course, with the lecture focusing on what students don't understand, with our not giving them the theories, but rather they're having to discover and fight to understand the theories. When you go into the Chemistry Discovery Center, you hear laughter and you hear people arguing in the most constructive of ways, and everybody's using technology. Nobody's using paper and pencil. You've got one person at the whiteboard who is the project manager, somebody else who's the blogger, somebody else who's the provocateur. Everybody has a role in a group of 4. And the roles change throughout the semester. I get plenty of emails the first part of the semester from students saying, I hate this course. I got a 5 in AP chemistry. Why must I do this? I've never needed anybody. I don't need anybody. That's what bright kids are taught in high school in America, that they don't need anybody. Why must I work in a group? How dare a part of my grade be determined by what happens in the group, right? We've got a weak person in this group. Why must I work with somebody who's not as smart as I am? These are the kinds of questions I get from really bright, high-achieving kids with the 750 to 800 math SAT. They think, I don't need anybody. By midterm, all of the bickering stops because they begin to see the difference that it's made. Now, just in that chemistry course, what I'll tell you that's interesting is that there were those who felt that somehow when the grades seemed to be better than the traditional course, that somehow the standards were not as high. If more students are doing well, it must not be as rigorous. That's the immediate response. And yet, from having the American Chemical Society evaluate the standards, what we found was that the course is actually more rigorous than the traditional course. And we've had a 50% increase in the number of students getting a B or better. We've been able also to analyze, and this is good for our legislature, that every time a student has to retake that course, that one semester course, it costs the university $1,700. So we can actually quantify the benefit in addition to talking about what's just best for students. And the biggest challenge we face is that we've had almost a doubling of the number of chemistry and biochemistry majors in the last 6 years as a result of students doing well in that first year course. Now, in engineering, just as an example, Ann Spencer's course, she was writing here, she teaches a course in engineering mathematics that explores numerical methods for solving engineering problems using MATLAB. And the students actually first look at a video that usually is between 3 and 10 minutes that focuses on the classroom lecture, and then they take a pre-class quiz on Blackboard before coming to the lecture, and then what happens is that the lecture reinforces concepts that have not been grasped, and most important, there is a reviewing of what has not been understood before they get into problem solving in groups of 3. And so it's what's happening now in a lot of places, flipping the course so that you're emphasizing the group work in the class, and they are preparing for the class and empowered to learn as much as they can on their own before they come. The result has been a 10-point increase in average scores on the exams through the final over several years, and with the quality of students' background being the same, with the same concepts and materials developed. Now, why is that important to go through the evaluation? There are, on all of your campuses, there are some people who are interested in rethinking how things are done, and there are other people who would feel things are just fine. And the question becomes, how do we encourage and support colleagues in perhaps rethinking the approach in some cases? For us, it started about 10 years ago when we became the first Kauffman campus in our state. To have one of these grants focused on entrepreneurship. And the reason I keep talking about the relationship to other disciplines was this. At first, some of my colleagues in some disciplines thought that we were tainting the institution by becoming so closely connected to seeming like what they said, so vocational in approach. And then what was really fascinating was when some of the alums from the arts came back and said, we know our craft, and yet we know nothing about entrepreneurship. Or we have all these skills, but when it comes to revenues and expenditures and working with customers and looking at ways of building the business, we've not had those experiences. So it was very helpful to colleagues to hear their graduates saying, yes, you taught me the craft, but you didn't connect it to what I'm going to be doing in real life in using the craft with society, with customers, with engagement. And that convinced some colleagues, not only in the arts, but in the social sciences and humanities, because social entrepreneurship has become a big theme on our campus. And so we began to have these entrepreneurship, these Kauffman Fellows and faculty institutes, and then the leaders like you, people who become the leaders and ambassadors for the work. And still today in America, as all of you know, large numbers of people who've not been involved in entrepreneurship would somehow think it would change or tarnish the image of the institution to be seen as too vocational. And I'm a strong believer in the liberal arts. As I've said over and over again, first of all, I have to say to my colleagues in humanities and social sciences that math and science are part of the liberal arts. I won't allow one discipline to take, and that when I look at what we do in engineering, if you look at ABET accreditation standards right now, there's a solid rooting in the liberal arts, in the humanities. I mean, it's very clear when talking about ethical reflection that in accreditation agencies now, ABET talks a lot about that. And so whether one's going to be an engineer or a physician, we know it's very important to look at societal values and impact on society. And so what I'm saying is that I think you have the opportunity to do two things. Number one, to talk about these flipping of courses. That was one course I mentioned. The other one that's been fascinating is this fluid mechanics course where Chuck Eggleton is doing exactly the same thing and getting students in the habit, quite frankly, of looking at flipped courses. But this is what I want you to hear as this final example. This is in chemical engineering. Govind Raya, one of my colleagues, offers a course for undergrads in sensor technology. It's called An Introduction to Sensors and Instrumentation that seeks to infuse entrepreneurship throughout the student body in that group. Students from a variety of disciplines learn about the process of generating and protecting intellectual property. They're required to come up with a conceptual product based on sensor technology and develop a business plan around it. For a capstone assignment, groups of students propose a product based on solid technical fundamentals while at the same time conducting market surveys analyzing the competition, and developing financials. This holistic approach exposes them to the real world and moves and breaks down the silos that often exist across disciplines, even within engineering. In one semester, for example, he charged the groups of students to develop a low-cost incubator for infants in markets in Africa, India, China, and the Philippines. They had to understand the local needs, the healthcare sector, parts and materials available locally, and develop products and a sales strategy particular to the location. He involved GE and other government and social experts in the process as mentors and judges for the students. The project evolved into one funded by the National Collegiate Inventors and Innovators Alliance, and a team of students right now is developing a low-cost incubator for the Indian market. And so more and more we are looking at ways of connecting students and classes, undergrads in addition to the grad class, but undergraduates to companies, to national agencies, and to others around the world. Right now, Mark Zupan, another faculty member, finally is on a Fulbright in Portugal, and he has developed a course that gives students there at the university in Portugal and our students in a class, the same class, an opportunity to work as a team in a multidisciplinary, multicultural approach to focus on global engineering, with the idea that to prepare students for global engineering and for multinational companies, it's great when students can go to other countries, but many people can't afford to go to other countries immediately while they're in college. That's just reality. And so the question is, he's doing actually an actual research study in a very entrepreneurial way of looking at ways of virtually giving students these out-of-country experiences to hear different perspectives, to learn to listen to different points of view, and to see how the values are different, and to connect the technical side to the customer-based side, looking at what's happening in different cultures around the world. Those are just examples. You take those examples of course redesign, and you add to it what we've done with this Meyerhoff program at first that focused on building groups of students who support each other, talking very proactively about the values that are important, getting away from the idea of cutthroat, more towards collaboration, more towards appreciating what group work can mean, and you begin to change the culture of the institution. You know, it was Aristotle who said many years ago that excellence is never an accident. I like that. Excellence is never an accident. It is the result, he said, of high intention, sincere effort, and intelligent execution. It represents choosing among a wide range of options. And finally, he said this: choice, not chance, determines your destiny. Choice, not chance, determines your destiny. The question for America, the question for all of us is, what do we choose? Thank you all very much. Okay. So let's take questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Question, all right?
Stay.
Okay, yes, Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. We will continue now with Q&A. Doug and Sarah are going to roll the audience with microphones, and we'd like to turn this food for thought that Freeman gave us into an open-ended discussion here. And while our microphones are getting in position, I'll start with a question. You mentioned, in context of sharing the Southwest Airlines,
Yes.
that culture is who you are.
Yes.
And I would call that character.
Yes.
Who you are. And how does a public university go about emphasizing the who you are in a society that seems to emphasize performance, the what you do, and equating that superficially with character and culture? So how do you get to that important question of who you are?
It's an excellent question. First of all, I often say to my students that one's character has everything to do with, quite frankly, who you are when you think people are watching you, and who you are and what you would do when you don't think anybody is watching you. I want you to think about that a minute. That for students, I say your character really comes through in what you decide you will or will not do when your mother's not looking at what you're doing, quite frankly. It gets to the essence of who you are. Years ago, through this process of shared governance and having robust conversations among faculty leaders, we began to talk about the role of values at a public university. And there were some colleagues, brilliant people, who said, we can't talk about values at a public university. I mean, we come from different religions or none at all, and they went on from there. And others said things like this, but aren't there some values we would all consider absolutely essential to life in America as we would want it to be? Whether it's about honesty or respect for other people, or appreciation of differences, or in the academy, high academic expectations for ourselves and for our students. And we went on with that list and said, who would dare question that? And we are said to be an honors university for a couple of reasons. We talk a great deal about this notion of cheating. I can't tell you how often I have had middle-class parents, people who are from the professions, ask me why we're so hard on a student just because the student cheated. All he did was cheat. I mean, it's amazing to me how people, adults, middle class of all races, sometimes now can think, why would you punish somebody for being dishonest? It's my son, right? And the fact is that we are educational institutions, and so we do need to understand we all make mistakes, and we have to give people support in dealing with that mistake, but we also, it seems to me, when talking about values, have to make the point, I think at our university, and I would say in our country, that it's wrong to cheat, that it's wrong to be dishonest, or not to respect other people, or to steal from people. And so for me, Jim, as I think about character of the country, of our nation, and of our institutions of higher education as a sector and of individuals, character has everything to do with the values we hold dear and our willingness to stand up and say what those values are and how important we think they are in living our lives. And the good news for my campus is that my colleagues, even without agreeing sometimes to disagree, have made it very clear on our campus that these values are points we're going to continue to build on. And entrepreneurship, by the way, is another, across disciplines. Yes, in engineering, we expect the engineers. They're the ones who are commercializing, taking it to the next level. But the question is, have we gotten to the point where other colleagues across disciplines appreciate that we should stop talking about those people out there? You know, when we criticize the business community saying those people out there, those are our graduates. I would even say when we talk about Congress and we talk about those are our graduates. Think about it. So when you talk about values, whether it's Congress or the business community, they are us. And it seems to me a part of this point about character is our accepting responsibility for our graduates and for what we've done to either prepare them to listen to others and to have the right values or not.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm Hal Freed. I'm an economics professor at Union College in upstate New York. And I would appreciate it if you could share with us some of your experiences in changing culture at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I mean, it's very difficult. It's a challenging environment, diverse faculty, many disciplines. How do you bring about cultural change?
It's an excellent question, and we are focusing on it constantly. I would say several things. Number one, we really did start with the tough issue of the underperformance of students of color on our campus 25 years ago. And the fact is, if you've never seen large numbers of black kids or Hispanic kids excelling in general or particularly in STEM, then it's not that you're racist or prejudiced, you've just not seen it. So on our campus, when I asked the question, who are the smart black kids? Somebody said, if a kid can get a C in organic chemistry and they're black, they're really smart. Students said that. Faculty said that, a C, all right? I found out we had never had a black earn an A in an upper-level science or engineering course in the history of the university. Now, when some colleagues said that's not true, and they found some, they were always educated K through 12 in another country. There's a big difference between kids educated in New York or in DC versus in Lagos or in Barbados, British education, right? So being honest about the data, first of all, just seeing what is happening right now can make a big difference in getting people to at least talk about the issues. Now, in terms of changing the culture itself, though, what I have found is that it's not done in a systemic way where everybody changes attitudes. It's very important to say this. you always start with the people who have an interest in seeing how things might be different. Some small group. You begin having conversations with those people who are saying, we can do better than this. And begin the conversation. And from that beginning conversation, brainstorm about some strategies and steps that might be taken to try different approaches. This is how we got to this Mile program. Because the question was asked, well, suppose we brought in the highest achieving kids we could find. How far could we take them? What should be the goal? And we decided to be bold. In the spirit of Jim Collins, bold, hairy goals. We said, we're not talking about these kids to just make it in engineering. We want them to have done so well in engineering and science, to have been so immersed in the research, to have done so well in the grades that they'll want to go to grad school and they'll go on and get PhDs and become the leaders. It's like what you talk about in producing leaders in entrepreneurship, for example, all right? So the goal of having some who are so good, they really are going to become first-rate leaders. And it took 2 years of going through that effort to get the first A in a course. It was very surprising, it really was, to get just the first A. But once we broke the barrier, the first A, then we moved on to get more. Now, the point is that as students began to do better, as we figured out strategies that were working, amazingly, more and more faculty were interested in saying, well, what are you doing? How is this happening? What can I do to be involved? How can I get a kid in my lab? And more and more. And one of the things I did in the early years was to take colleagues around to look in the labs. And this is what you'll find. At most places where you've got a lot of research going on, people will, if you've got a diverse population and of diverse faculty, my students from a particular country would be with faculty from that same country. So the Chinese kids were with the Chinese faculty. The Portuguese kids were with the few women had more women, of course, as you might expect. And so I said, well, so where are the blacks and Hispanics supposed to go? Because we didn't have any black and Hispanic faculty, right? And so the point was we had to be proactive in getting beyond our comfort zone to help students become more active, but also to have faculty who'd reach out to some kids and pull them in to that group. It's hard if you're the only woman and you got a group of men. And all of a sudden, you're supposed to be the pioneer. Now, we did the same thing, quite frankly, with the advanced program. Some of you know about advanced in science and engineering. The program started because MIT, it showed, the women there showed there was discrimination after all in these modern times. And so NSF has this multi-million-dollar program. We got one of the grants, and I decided to be the PI on the advanced grant because I wanted to make the point that men should be as concerned about the underrepresentation of women in STEM as anybody else, because it's not a woman's problem, it's an American problem. Just as whites have to be involved with the minority issue, because again, it's an American issue. And so I had 4 or 5 co-PIs, women who were chairs of departments, and 4 professors. But what was interesting was this. The same approach we used in beginning to improve minority student performance was very helpful in beginning to look at the issue of the shortage of women in tenure track and tenured positions in science and engineering. Because when we said there's a problem with women in STEM, most of the guys on campus said, what do you mean there's a problem with women in STEM? We've got plenty of women in every department. Well, the women tended not to be in tenure track and tenured positions, and rarely in leadership positions. They were technicians. They were lecturers, right? And then when we did the survey to ask the question, are there problems in each department or challenges involving gender? All of the women, assisted through 4 professors, said, yeah. All of the old guys like me said, no, not a problem at all. Everything's fine. Only the junior men agree with the women. You get what I'm saying? And it was like kindergarten. The boys on one side, the girls on the other. And here was the challenge about changing culture. The women were not saying these are bad men or bad guys. It's just there were issues that were not being discussed. Give you an example. Often when a woman would bring up an issue about her child, people would think she's not as serious as a researcher because she's concerned more about other things than the work itself. The fact was that most of the successful senior professors had had wives who stayed at home. Most of the women who had husbands, both people were working. And so they had more responsibilities. And it was amazing that what we had to do was to create a climate in which nobody was pointing fingers at individuals, but rather saying, these are just problems we need to look at analytically to see how we can begin to solve them. And what's the difference? 10 years ago, only 12% of our faculty, tenure track and tenured faculty in STEM were women, 12%. Today it's 39%, with 51% of our assistant professors who are women. having everything to do with looking at the data, getting small groups together to discuss the issues, and then brainstorming about ways that we might make a difference, whether in mechanical engineering all the way over to physics. Same kind of issue. Same kind of. And right now, if you were to ask me the biggest problem with gender diversity in America, I would say it's in the computational sciences. Even worse problem than in mechanical engineering. We've got many more in chemical. I'm really proud that half of our faculty in chemical engineering are women right now. But in computational sciences, if you don't know it, we've had a 50% decrease in the numbers of women cross races in America in the last decade. A 50% decrease in the number of women. It's down now to something between 15 and 20% of the majors are women, at a time when we need more people in these areas than ever before. So changing culture has to do with getting the data, understanding it, and then isolating particular parts of the problem and deciding how you might work on it. For us, the solution right now involves a Center for Women in Information Technology and Engineering. They're CWIT scholars. And these are women and some men focused on helping K through 12 and other women to succeed in engineering and IT, and actively being ambassadors to talk about the issues. A part of changing the culture means talking about whatever the issues are. And this is why I'm saying the issue for all of you, I'm saying as a part of your entrepreneurial spirit, is to go back and say, okay, so what is the probability that women who start off in mechanical engineering succeed? And if they're not succeeding, how might we bring some of them together to see what were the problems? What were the issues? I'll give you just one final strategy in terms of culture. If students earn C's in the first year of work, it's just about over. In math, in physics, in a lot of these areas, if you're barely making a C in the lower level work, it's really hard to believe you're gonna make A's and B's in the higher level work. It gets harder, folks. We know that, right? And so the question is, how do you help build that foundation? And then and the other issue was, we were starting all the students in second, because a lot of our students, ours is an honors campus. So you're talking about that top quarter of my students, of the freshman class, the mean SAT math and verbal is probably 1450. And for black kids in the 1300s. So these are high achieving kids. And even they were not making it though, in a lot of cases. And here's the point. Many of them were starting with second year work because they already had 40 AP credits. And so doing analytics, if I were to tell you one thing I would suggest to you in the spirit of entrepreneurship, it's the same thing that companies do. How do we use analytics in higher education and engineering in order to have data-driven decision making? We in universities, even in STEM, tend to make decisions based on anecdotes rather than analysis of data. I've got some articles in EDUCAUSE that my colleagues and I wrote on how we're using analytics on everything from the customer base, top high school sending us kids and what we learn from them, all the way to changing the culture by looking at what happens when students come in and they start with a much more advanced course because they got 5s on AP credits. And what I can tell you is there's about a 0.2 chance that they'll get an A in that course when they have the 5s on BC calculus, for example, and they start with Cal 3, 0.2, And so giving families that information to say, yes, AP credits are great, they've given you a foundation, but having written questions for SAT and math and everything, I can tell you, AP is more formulaic. You've got the formulas, you got the problems, you're taught how to plug in high school, but in your classes in engineering or in mathematics and physics, the fact is, if I give you 5 problems, 3 of them will be like the ones you've seen before. 2 I'm going to change around. I want to see if you can really think. And if you haven't learned to think critically, you're lost. And you're saying, oh my God, I haven't seen that before. And so even though you know most of the facts, you end up getting a D. So I would say changing the culture that way. And finally, adding on the societal value. Right now, I'm really excited this semester they're doing the statics course, and the students are having these projects involving building ramps for disabled people in different urban environments, for example. So it's connecting the technical side to something of societal value that they can see from the beginning. Very important as a part of changing culture.
Hi, I'm Leo Hannafin from University of Detroit Mercy, and I'd like to keep the conversation going about culture, but more broadly about university culture than STEM culture,
yes,
which is most of what you've been talking about. I know you talked earlier about the other. We're partners with Villanova, Dayton, and Baylor, all religiously sponsored institutions, so we wear our values on our sleeve, and we're doing a study of innovation in corporations, and one of the areas we've talked with 10 major corporations about is culture. Now you mentioned that culture and operations are quite different, But when talking to one leader, Derek Kuzak, who was Group Vice President for Product Development Worldwide for Ford, and I asked him about culture, and he said, I'm not sure how you manage culture, but I know how to manage, as an engineer, operational processes and operational plans. And in doing so, he went on to describe in some detail how those had influenced culture. Now let's bring it back to the university and how the university gets the non-STEM partners on board
Yes.
with this entrepreneurship and innovation.
Yes,
We've
yes.
had mixed success with that at University of Detroit Mercy, I'll admit. Some great successes with some colleges and departments, and fall on our sword with others. Do you have any processes or plans or ways in which you brought
Yes.
the non-STEM
Yes.
gang
Sure.
on board with this whole party?
Yes, it's a great question. But is Garibaldi your president? Is Antoine? So your dean is one of my graduates. Your dean, your new dean is a UMBC graduate. Yeah, I've been hearing all about that. I'm really proud of you. I keep hearing about you. I got to meet you. I mean, I got it. I mean, the older we get, the more we know everybody, right? This is great. I see. That's wonderful. Garibaldi was telling me that. I'm really proud of that. Well, here is what I would say. First of all, I do still stand by the idea that culture is who you are, but I think who you are has a direct impact on how you do things. So I would say the way we manage people and operations is directly connected to and with, quite frankly, the culture and who we are. They go back and forth. I was working with one of the national agencies in intelligence, and they said the biggest problem they have is they can find the technical people, but that the people don't know how to manage people. That, you know, and I gave this talk on leadership and what it really means, and interestingly enough, as I was walking out with a very bright guy, you know he's always gotten perfect everything on SAT, all the way to GRE and everything else, and he said, well, I want to be a leader. He said, but do I have to like people to manage them? I love that. I just love that. It speaks volumes. And, you know, my mother was this English teacher, so I said, you know, it was T.S. Eliot who said about somebody, they had the experience but missed the point completely. He really missed it. So the point is that as I think about this relationship between culture and the operations and about engineering and the rest of the institution, or where we may not have this, what we found through that Kaufman experience was that, again, in terms of going back to the question about changing culture, identifying a few people who are willing to try something from history department, from the arts, from photography, for example, who are willing to say, well, let's see what this is all about. Getting a few people in a faculty institute, for example, can be fascinating across disciplines to hear different perspectives. It was really amazingly transformative for colleagues from certain disciplines to see how colleagues in some of the engineering areas had used undergrad courses not only to teach technical skills, but to broaden the thinking of students about how you work with people in the inner city or in working on challenges in Africa, you know, and how you connect the technical side to the societal value. Because what could be more humanistic than that, you see? And as a result, we began to get believers. And so we had Kaufman Fellows, entrepreneurship fellows, in the humanities and social sciences. And the first issue that people brought up was, well, why should I be? This is entrepreneurship. And that's when we got to social entrepreneurship, which has an amazing possibilities there. And then people in economics, we began to do some opportunity hires in certain areas in the arts and in economics, focused on entrepreneurship. For example, risk analysis is very interesting, and people who are interested in working with people across disciplines from economics to help them in thinking about beyond their technical area, how they might use mathematical modeling in the risk analysis work. And what happened was that more and more we've been having now every summer these faculty institutes, and the numbers of fellows are growing. And the really nice thing is, as a result of that, I got this Carnegie Award a year ago, and we were able to match it with a lot of money of fundraising for my 20th year as president this past semester. And so we now have a big chunk of money to inspire and to encourage faculty to write proposals for innovation and entrepreneurship across disciplines. So we had 25 proposals this year. We've just funded the first 6. And we'll be highlighting, and that's across disciplines, engineering, the arts, humanities, and it's the Hrabowski Innovation Fund. But the idea, and then there's a Kaufman Innovation Fund, and these are focused on teaching and learning and connecting it to the research and interesting ways of connecting across disciplines and across sectors, public and private sectors, national agencies, companies, pulling more of them into the work. And what that does is to highlight the best of the best. And it encourages faculty to look at the possibilities. I think the more people who are not in engineering have a chance to see how you are connecting students to societal issues, quite frankly, the more people in the humanities and social sciences will appreciate the fact that you've got a kind of thread of those disciplines throughout the work they're doing. And the more you'll see opportunities for perhaps even seminars across areas. One of the really exciting new seminars for first-year students now that's getting so hot that we're more and more moving to more and more students wanting to take it is on invention and imagination and innovation. And it's across disciplines. So we've got these first-year seminars. We had just one other example that you'll appreciate. If you go to the Chronicle this past semester, there was a 3-part series on a first-year seminar we had that was called Math and What It Means to Be Human. And taught by Manil Suri, who's a mathematician who's now writing novels that are first bestsellers in India, while he's still doing statistical work and working with engineers, and by somebody who's a Shakespeare expert who was very interested in getting immersed into the technical side. And it almost sounds, again, counterintuitive, and yet, look at the 3-part series in the Chronicle of Higher Education as an example. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Dan Cole from Boston University.
And
I'll give you this. Say that at your university, 45% of the graduates are in science and engineering. Mm-hmm. So I was curious as to how this was achieved.
Yes.
And what do you think is an optimal level for an average, for various schools? I mean, you said 6% in the U.S.
6% of the 24-year-olds and almost 12% in Europe. And for our campus, in a good year, 45%, in a year not quite as good, 40%. Between 40 and 45% of my bachelor's degrees are in science and engineering. At the doctoral level, it's probably 60%, because we focus in research in those areas heavily. But here's the point. The percent who are with bachelor's degrees, it seems to me, should be closely related to the interests of the freshmen, of the students who come to the institution. That's the first point. And that number will depend on how the institution views itself. As you think about the types of students you want, the level of preparation, and quite frankly, the interests of those students in relationship to the resources on the campus. Because you've got to think about the size of the faculty, right, in those areas. And for us, the challenge that we have faced is that it took me a long time to convince my colleagues in the humanities and social sciences that I really did believe in the humanities and social sciences, because we were pushing this math and science and engineering so much because we were trying to build the economy in the Baltimore area. And people could get that. I mean, you could get them to see that if we can have more companies, now 85 companies, lots of jobs for people, right? Now, I would say the creative class, the book by Richard Glass, is really important, that you need the artists and the humanities and those people too. What happened that helped us a great deal was that as a result of the success in producing more kids going on to engineering, we've got almost 1,000 graduates at the National Security Agency now, as an example. So large numbers of my graduates are pulling in kids. I mean, the coolest thing on my campus for an engineer or a computer person to say is, "Doc, can't tell you what I'm working on, I'd have to kill you." They love telling me that. And now I said, boy, I was hearing that before you were born. So, they just love telling me that all the time. And the fact is that, well, there's Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, all these companies, we talk, even in our recruitment, about this value of both science and engineering and arts and humanities and social sciences. And we say we should not say one on one side and one on the other, because we want our engineers to know how to do ethical reflection, to write well, to communicate. If you look at the skills you talk about, not just for global engineering, but in general, they are rooted in the arts and humanities. They really are. I mean, the creativity, the communication skills, and I really believe that engineers should talk about that a lot and not allow people to suggest that you're only doing something that's technical, because you're teaching people how to express themselves. You're teaching people how to listen to the needs and problems that people face. And what we talk about is, I mean, you think about the three big areas: healthcare, we all want to live longer and be healthier, right? The environment, clearly, is a critical issue, Tom Freeman and all the books and what we're doing with global warming. And then finally, quite frankly, defense. And, you know, and in our area, we're really sensitive to that because of the intelligence community. And large numbers of my students are from military families. Thousands are from military families, and they want to serve their country. You know, and I shouldn't just say in defense, but also in making the peace. In making the peace. I've got engineers who are working with DOD on issues involving making the peace, which I think is just as important, which is even more noble than just defending your country. You know, I was amazed when one of the key people from DOD came and wanted to work with us on a grant, and he said, what do you think is most important to keeping a village supportive of America? And people came up with all kinds of things, and he said two things. He said clean water and basic health care. And he said, and it was amazing, he said, and we need the engineers who can commercialize products that can be easily used by people who don't have all the medical training. You know, and it was amazing for both faculty and students to hear that when talking about societal issues. Usually when we think about defense, we think always about war, but even more important than defending, it seems to me, is in creating the kinds of relationships around the world with people who appreciate that we use the science and technology to help humankind. And engineers are at the heart of that work, is what I would say. You know, the final point is, I think that I'm telling my fellow mathematicians, we've got to let the world know we are important. Because you see, all students in high school think it's cool to be an engineer. They don't think it's cool to be a mathematician. You think about it, they want to be, and I think we need both. You know, so I often will tease my students who are engineers, and I say, but we mathematicians are really philosopher queens and kings about, because you couldn't do the engineering if you didn't have the math. We're at the base of all of it. But if you think of what is the reason, let me ask this question. What is the number one reason that human beings are living much longer today? First of all, how old do you think? What was the average lifespan in 1900? Who knows?
About 42, 43.
That's actually, they say about 40, You're absolutely right. If they're lucky, 42, 43 in 1900. People, the average lifespan, think about it, 40. What is it today?
78.
Yep. And for women, even higher. It really is. For guys, 78. Women, about 82. It's very interesting. The women, 82. That's really nice. The fact is, what's the number one reason? You already know. Somebody who doesn't. I want somebody to guess. One or two of you know. What would you say? Technology. But more specifically, the sewage system. I learned that from the National Academy of Engineering. Isn't that amazing? The sewage system, and people were dying because of contaminated water. Look at when they were writing the Constitution. Look at what happened in Philadelphia. People had to leave the city because of the fever. It was a real problem. And yet, as a former head of the NAA, he was saying, but engineers don't get credit for that. And a part of the issue, I'm convinced, and this is what I tell my students, a part of being entrepreneurial leaders, is for engineers to represent the discipline. To talk about how this is not just about the techies, this is about saving lives. You know, I think it's very important that we find ways of helping our students in technical areas to make the point that we are as much a part of helping humanity as anyone, that we use the humanities and social sciences in solving problems. We are creative, quite frankly, and we make a difference in the lives of people. There's nothing I think can be more contaminated water. We don't appreciate the value of clean water until we go to a country where you can't even brush your teeth unless you use bottled water. You get my point? That's because of engineers. And I think that needs to be said.
Thank you for the really inspiring talk. It gives us a lot more ammunition, so obviously most of us are interested in carrying this message forward. So my name's Don Carpenter. I'm with Lawrence Technological University in Southfield, Michigan. A lot of what we've been talking about is very strategic.
Yes.
Many of us in the room are interested in very tactical type initiatives.
Yes.
We have a series of Shaping Entrepreneurial Engineers workshops that we've developed. Last year we did one on statics and mechanics.
Yes.
We're currently planning two others, several of us in the room. One is on thermofluids. Another one is on ethics and the influence of technology, ethical implications of advanced technologies.
Excellent.
So the tactical question is, you mentioned several courses that have been flipped that we would be, I'd like to know more information about.
Yes.
The hydromechanics course, the statics course, the chemistry course. How do we get in touch with those faculty specifically? Who should we contact to get specific information in terms of case study?
That's excellent. I love that idea, because I think that give you just one institution that I think does a very good job of connecting people is the Howard Hughes Medical Institutions. If you look at what they do with HHMI researchers and the undergrad research, they have conferences of this kind for people across to share best practices, and there's such a need to do that. Ann Spence, S-P-E-N-C-E, is an amazing professor at UMBC who has done everything. She heads the Project Lead the Way. She's the master teacher in that first year mechanical engineering, but she also teaches this engineering mathematics course, and she can connect you with others such as Chuck Eggleton, who's the chair of the department who teaches the fluid mechanics course, and Mark Zupan, who is the global engineering guy, is really impressive. But Ann Spence can get you to all of those people in those areas. If you get a chance to look at because we're doing more writing, that's the other thing I would encourage you to do as you are developing courses and initiatives designed to foster innovation and entrepreneurship, to take the time to write about it. I know you've done some things, the Foundation's done some great things with Journal of Engineering Education, which I think is great. Because one of the challenges, and let me be very honest about this from my perspective, is that a lot of institutions, bigger places, public places, place less emphasis on undergrad education than I think should be placed on it. One of the reasons my campus is having such success is that my colleagues and I said years ago, who is it the public really cares about? They care about undergraduates. They want to know that returning students and freshmen are okay. All right? We expect grad students to do well. We expect that, and we need to give them support, of course. But I do think that you can help in the Foundation in leading the effort to get more public institutions of whatever size more focused on their moral responsibility to help students succeed. And for me, the entrepreneurship effort, the innovation effort will involve, yes, preparing leaders, but I'm saying even more fundamental than preparing entrepreneurial leaders is making sure people are succeeding and becoming a part of the workforce. I mean, and that's why I'm saying you go back, do the analytics, look at what percent, what's the probability, and if a student doesn't make it, do you know why that student doesn't make it? Is it because of the academic preparation? We know that if a student comes in with a background below a certain level, SAT-wise or grade-wise, that student has a very slim chance of making it in engineering. We know that there are certain attitudes that one has to have about study habits, for example. We know that we have to teach more of our engineers that it's not enough to be great with the technical side, but that they do need to have the internships, and they do need to get beyond the coursework, quite frankly, in preparing for the best job opportunities. And that's why we're trying to convince more and more to get involved in small companies. And we have an idea lab, for example, with entrepreneurship, where we have these competitions where we are really highlighting the value of creativity in technical areas and starting companies. It's amazing what that can do. And those would be the suggestions. Okay? Yes? Mm-hmm.
I'm Greg Freeman from Baylor University, and for a while I was doing chemical engineering at the business school. But I have a couple colleagues now. I loved your example about the chemistry lab and the fact that you added the analytics to it. Mm-hmm. I know in talking to a lot of my colleagues who didn't get to go over the dark side like I did and are still in engineering classrooms, one of the common frustrations I hear about is, yeah, I get that and I love that, but you don't understand that there is no room. If I put any of this business stuff in here, I can't possibly maintain the rigor of these really important technical topics.
Right.
Now, in your examples about the engineering classes, as fun as they sounded, I didn't hear the analytics that said, you know, the rigor is still happening. I'm sure you have that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's an excellent question. And what I would say, somebody said it very well, specificity is everything. Govind Rao for the sensor course, for example, is a great example because he's had a company that's now been sold, and but more important than that, the undergraduates who do this research tend to do one of two things. First of all, the rigor is there, and we've had it tested over and over again. I mentioned that we've got 45% in science and engineering. We also have the highest percentage who go to grad school. We have about 40% of students across disciplines, across races, going immediately to grad school. Govind had 8 black kids in a class of 30 one year, and all of them went on for MD, PhDs, or PhDs in chemical engineering, from Stanford to MIT. between Harvard and MIT. So we have we do the analysis looking at performance in graduate schools, where they go to work, what employers say about them, and even more important when it comes to entrepreneurship, how many are willing to take risks and go to places that are not the big places, for example, or to start their own companies. And so we are documenting all the students who are beginning their own companies. And it is fascinating to see the progression of those companies along the way, but it's the documentation that makes the difference in terms of once they graduate. It's also, I'll give you another example, the entrepreneurship minor that these faculty fellows, talk about changing the culture, came up with this idea. Why don't we have this idea of a track of courses that could vary depending on the major of the student, that would be a track in entrepreneurship. So, for example, in mechanical engineering, it got to the point now that I think there are 5 courses and a couple of labs involved, and 3 of the courses have already had entrepreneurship infused into the existing courses. And so to get this minor, they just have 2 more courses to take, which is also an incentive for more to do it. I will say something that I said to Doug last night that may be a little counter, but I want you to think about it anyway. You talk about producing 100% of entrepreneurs. Well, I take that in the spirit of 100% exposure to entrepreneurship education, because the fact is there are faculty and students who will never be entrepreneurs. There's some who will. You in this room are interested in innovation and entrepreneurship. There's some wonderful faculty who may not want to be entrepreneurs, but there's a certain mindset when you talk about an entrepreneurial spirit. Now, I mean, and it does involve something that can be a little scary. It's getting beyond that you're comfortable with. It's being willing to take more risk. You know, I've had a chance to work a lot with NIH, and for years, one of the challenges at a lot of the institutes, such as NIGMS and others, was that young scientists often were unwilling to take big risks, because if the risk failed, if they failed because of that risk, they wouldn't get funding. So they had to come up with particular funding for high-risk projects in order to encourage more people to do it. People are going to do whatever they think is going to bring the kind of result they want. And if they're only rewarded when something wins, they're not going to be very entrepreneurial. So the question is, how do you find those students and those faculty who really do have that kind of bent, so that if given the opportunity, they will push the envelope? Entrepreneurship really does require pushing the envelope. When we started the Research Park 20-some years ago, we had more resistance on and off campus than you could imagine. In the paper, it was, you know, and what were some of the reasons? Well, neighbors were saying, it's University of Maryland, Baltimore County, we are adjacent to the BWI airport, so we've got 500 acres. It was like a farm until the 50s. And so there was land that we could use, but neighbors were saying, if you start these biotech companies, you're gonna have all these germs in the neighborhood. This is the American way of thinking about science and engineering, folks, because we've not done enough to help them understand science and engineering help people. So my response was, and how many of you have lived here for decades? And they raised their hands, and I said this. I said, if my freshmen haven't blown you up in the chemistry labs, I promise you, the PhDs in biotech won't blow you up, all right? To which they responded, well, let's get rid of that chemistry then. So until Americans understand that they need the chemistry to live, right? Until they see the relationship, they can be very afraid of it. And then traffic was the other big. And then finally, it was from some of my colleagues outside of STEM who felt this was going to take too much emphasis away from the university, as opposed to thinking, no, this will allow the university to be even more connected to the larger community, which is a part of what entrepreneurship is all about. It's how do you break down the boundaries, not only across disciplines, but between public and private sector, between colleges and universities and the larger community, because quite frankly, we shouldn't think of them as the real world and us as some idealistic place. We are the real world. We're preparing people for that other part of the real world, but think about it. We tend to use the metaphor, we're getting them ready for the real world. Well, the real world is on our campus. We've got all kinds of people on our campus, and we are preparing people to be in that sector, that part of the real world. And that's what entrepreneurship does. It breaks down the boundaries, it seems to me, and pushes people to be less risk adverse. That's the idea. Let me leave you with one thought. One final question. Did I see a question? Here's a question. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
I am Maria Vaz, and I'm the provost at Lawrence Technological University. And my question is also technical.
Yes.
Technical. Thank you very much for your great inspiration, frankly.
Thank you.
And is related to experience of the student. There are two possibilities of us to change the way you change your culture. And one of them is, let me just give you an example of your chemistry class.
Yes.
I do not know if all the sections of your chemistry, all the sections in chemistry will do exactly the same thing, or if you are relying more on a really great professor in chemistry that is doing this, and then a great professor in mechanical engineering that is doing something else. And the students, by having different experiences, end up having a great education. Or if you just work with all the professors in chemistry to make sure that the students have all the same experience, and then move into the different courses, making sure that the students have the same experiences. So these are two different strategies, and I would like to know what is your opinion.
It's an excellent question, great question. For us, we have looked at the relationship between some first-rate lecturers and research faculty, and we take great pride in having research faculty working with freshmen. But we also have a level of consistency in some of the Chemistry Discovery Center work involving some first-rate lecturers who are PhDs, who are focused on teaching, quite frankly, all right? So all of the students go through the Chemistry Discovery Center, and there's consistency with certain people who are really focused on that work, doing research in that area of the teaching of chemistry. Same thing in teaching of physics and some other areas. As a result, they're all getting that experience now because faculty buy into this notion of group work, collaboration at different levels of enthusiasm. You're going to always have students getting all kinds of experiences. Some people will never decide to change. We know that. Others will try different approaches. For us, changing the culture means convincing as many people as possible to consider other approaches to doing the work if it is the case that a number of students are not doing well in the class. And quite frankly, in any science and engineering class, a certain percentage are not doing well, on any of our campuses. And if the goal is to maximize the number succeeding, it seems to me that the approach is to encourage as many faculty as possible to try different approaches. And most important, to look at what others are doing to determine if it's something they might want to consider. The one point I did not make that I think is really important in support of faculty is it takes time for people to redesign courses. It takes time to rethink how to interact with students if they're not just getting up there to lecture the whole time. It takes time to learn best practice in use of technology. And it means the university, beyond engineering, investing a certain amount of money from NSF, from this foundation, other places, in order to give them the time not only to develop materials, but to develop professionally to see how others are doing things. To the extent that colleagues see we're not pushing anybody to do anything, but rather encouraging and supporting and empowering people to try different approaches, there's more buy-in to it. That's a part of changing the culture. Anytime, I have to tell CEOs this all the time. When they say, Freeman, just tell them to do it. No. You don't make anybody do anything in a college or university. I've been president 20 years, all right? My line is, I tell new college presidents this, all right? The fact is that presidents who are successful learn to kiss butt with dignity. Did you get that right? So if you're planning to be a president, prepare to kiss butt with dignity, all right? Right? We do it all the time. Let me leave you with this story in the spirit of, we Southerners, Baltimore is the upper South, I like to say. One day we think like Philadelphia, but the next day like Richmond. But I grew up in the deep South, in Birmingham. So this is a story about teaching, and I want you to, all of you educators, at the end of my mother's life, she had been this teacher of English and math for 35 years. And at the end of her life, my wife had convinced her to come to Baltimore from Birmingham. She didn't want to come because she didn't want to leave her church. We have churches in Baltimore, Mother. And finally got her to come up. She thought her church was the only one. And we realized she had been so smart that she was able to hide the fact that she was developing dementia. And you never like to see your parents go downhill. And it became so clear to us. In fact, it was clear to me within the first weeks that she was in our house that she didn't even know who I was. She was just charming and could sound, And I'm an only child, so it was just a devastating experience. And one day, we were out on the porch, beautiful day, and my mother looked at me and said, with the sweetest smile, I know the end is near. You don't want to hear that. And I said, well, what's important to you now? Because when somebody knows It's getting close to that time. You get the essence, the true character of the person. And she said this. She said, what's important? She said, relationships. She said, my relationship with God. And she could tell I was about to cry, and she was trying to strengthen me. She said, just hold on to your faith. Something she'd always said, just hold on to your faith. You'll be okay. Remember now, she's just looking at me, and I'm thinking she's knowing who I am. And then she said, my relationship with my husband, he's a wonderful man. She'd forgotten Daddy had died 20 years before. And then she shocked me. She looked me right in my face, and she said, you know, I have a son. And all of a sudden, my grief turned to anger, because I'm thinking, she's about to give me one of these movie stories where she had a kid as a teenager, never told me about it. She's going to drop this mess in my lap, die, and then I got to deal with some brother that I don't want. If I haven't had a brother in all these years, I don't want a brother, no. And then she said, he's a college president. Thank God she was talking about me. She just didn't know who I was. Wait a minute. But then she gave me the gift that I give to you. She said, but you know, I now understand that teachers touch eternity through their students. Teachers touch eternity through their students. Whatever I had to give, my sense of right and wrong, my lust for learning and my belief in them, I gave it to them, and I'll live through them. And I'll never forget going back to Birmingham and having all these teachers come up to me saying, your mother didn't teach me to read, she taught me to love to read. And your mother came into the projects and told my grandmother, send your granddaughter to college. And because I went to college, my younger brothers and sisters went to college, we could get our mother and grandmother out of the projects, out of poverty. Your mother lives in our hearts. I want you to remember, as you do the work of entrepreneurship, as you prepare these leaders, that more than you realize it, you are touching eternity. Thank you all very much.